Psychic Politics, an Aspect Psychology book by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Continuation Part 3, Chapter 25. The Heroic Dimension and Heroic Personages. Seth finished the, quote, unknown, end quote, reality that spring of 1975, a month or so after we moved. The text was so long that we decided to put it out in 2 volumes. Through the summer, I was working on the first draft of this book and decided not to resume regular classes for a while. Instead, I saw students about once a month. Our first July in our new house was exceptionally hot and muggy, even though the temperature was 10 degrees cooler on our hill than it was in town. I began working from 3 in the morning until 7, when the night air came rushing down from the hillsides and the daytime lawn mowers were quiet. In between library experiences and periods of inspiration, I'd type earlier portions of this book. I'd been typing for about a week when something clicked, and I began writing the material on codicils and the authority of the psyche. The material came all at once, in 4 or 5 days, like a package almost too big to handle. It came so quickly that I didn't have time to type it. Just took it down in longhand, sometimes as I sat in the backyard. I finished the material on a Friday. We had a busy weekend, and Monday was one of the hottest days of the year, 98 degrees. And humid. I'd planned to have our usual Seth session that night. About 8:30 p.m., the phone rang. A distressing call from a young man who was contemplating suicide. I applied a psychological bandage as best I could, reinforcing his own energy and will to live. But when he hung up, I felt weary and discouraged. Why, as a people, did we trust anything but the authority of the psyche? Seth or I could only help by triggering others to use abilities they already possessed, but believed they didn't have. Actually, most of my mail and calls are from people who are really putting Seth's ideas to work in their daily lives. Many of them have begun new businesses or creative endeavors as they examined their lives and became aware of abilities that they hadn't been utilizing before. But that night, after the young man's call, I thought angrily that lots of people didn't want to take the responsibility for their own lives. It was easier to blame their misfortunes on their backgrounds or fate or whatever. Suddenly Rob and I seemed very alone, without colleagues, without people at our own particular focus. twilight deepened. I put my papers away, clearing my mind for the Seth session. Still, the feeling of loneliness persisted and grew. It finally developed into a kind of yearning. For what? For people who were, wherever it was Rob and I were, a kind of homesickness for somewhere you'd never been? I sat back at the table again, staring out the window. Without transition, I sensed other strands of consciousness, coming from all directions, for which I was the vortex. They centered in me, merged into my own stream of consciousness, which carried them out into the world. Something else was going to happen in place of a Seth session. I found my attention centered on the wall, where the library usually appeared to my inner vision. An experience began that lasted for several hours. The trouble is that it happened at another level of activity. I could catch myself having experiences in the library that were behind the events I was aware of. I sensed huge models surrounding each visible and invisible particle that led these toward their greatest individual development, for example. But I felt as if all the knowledge of my own microscopic particles was being translated from, quote, their language, end quote, into symbols and images that I could understand. Each atom and molecule of my body had a psychic shape that promoted growth in different levels of existence. While this was going on, I sensed but didn't clearly see other people in the library. Colleagues of ours, waiting in other rooms through which I'd have to travel. That is, I had to go there. There was something different about these personalities, about the quality of their existence. The term came to me at once, seeming completely apt and inevitable, heroic personages. What I'm trying to describe now, in usual terms, I knew all at once, and something escapes when the experience is described in a linear fashion. I knew I'd been yearning toward the heroic dimension, that the library was a construct to help me in that search, and that these heroic personages existed in time and out of it. Again, I'll have to quote my original notes. I kept scribbling down what I could. Though some of the sentences are unfinished and often ungrammatical, they still retain part of my initial sense of wonder. Quote, I seem to be experiencing a dimension of being outside of time. The feeling of it is a lot different than just thinking that such a dimension might exist, that's for sure. I have 1 foot there and 1 foot right here now. This is a, quote, place, end quote, where our complete selves dwell, though, quote, complete, end quote, isn't the right word. Our whole selves, where they exist no matter what their parts are doing in time. It's a dimension where these superpersonalities, models, and heroic personages exist and help out their selves who exist in the world. Even if you're in time yourself, like me, you can go there under certain conditions, at least briefly. In fact, you can get yourself in a position where you almost have to go there to pursue your purposes and find answers that aren't available where you usually are. These heroic personages aren't ghosts. It's a completely different kind of psychological existence, another version of being. You can't get there till you're ready, and ready means not frightened and willing, because you see that the normal world alone doesn't provide the nourishment you want, or rather, you have to go further to learn what you want to know. You've gone as far as you can under the usual conditions. So your desire opens up this other heroic dimension. The heroic personages are like true adults, and Rob and I, in comparison, are like beloved students or younger colleagues. I sense others like us there too. It is, or will be, like coming home to a psychic family. I feel my allegiance changing, as if my reliable, strong contacts are there even emotionally, at the heroic level, rather than in the usual world, even though, in a strange way, I should be able to express my emotions more freely in normal life. In a way, Seth is like a traveling teacher, coming here, but now I have to go there, into the heroic dimension. Only I had to want to, and now I do. I'm not getting some of this right, but the heroic personages there are reflected in the psyche and help compose it in time, but their prime existence is in the heroic dimensions, outside of time. We've been taught to suspect such otherworldly yearnings, and I suspect that I make such an effort to take these notes just to keep up contact with known references. End. I had mental experiences that I just couldn't describe or correlate. Again, some seemed too fast to follow, and others seemed too slow. Somehow I connected the too fast experiences with an accelerated time sequence, and the slow ones with my attempt to translate activity at the heroic level. Finally, I shrugged my mental shoulders and decided to go to bed. As I went to sleep, I felt as if those experiences were continuing just beneath my usual awareness. I awakened at 5 a.m. Information about the heroic dimension came floating into my mind. I got up at once. The material wasn't finished copy as it usually was from the library. Instead, I knew certain things to be true. These knowings came one after another, as quickly as I could write them down. One exception, the first paragraph came exactly as given in the following notes. After that, though, the material came as comprehensions that I translated into usual language. Quote, "There are those who sense within the commonplace dimensions of life the existence of a larger-than-life experience, and who feel the presence of giant events and heroic personages whose superior qualities must remain outside of the human domain, even while they are reflected in it. That is, earthly life exists under the auspices of the heroic, toward which it ever aspires. We are like children in comparison to those sensed giant consciousnesses which all call our own heroic selves." End quote. That first paragraph strongly reminded me of the James material I'd received earlier. It came in a block, as if to initiate my own further experiences. As soon as I'd written it down, the comprehensions began to flow, which I then described in my own words. The paragraph also brought to mind my man and woman in the sky experience, and several others already described in this book. All of them implied a comparison between us as children in relation to a superior kind of adulthood. Quote, "We are one version of these heroic selves, which serve as our models. Some people have always sensed this heroic dimension, drawn upon it, and stood out in our world. The speakers, as described in Seth Speaks, the book, have given evidence of its existence, interpreting it in their own time periods and inserting new models of achievement. Rob and I have always reacted to each other at heroic levels, besides the usual interactions. I often react to myself in heroic terms. The trouble is, this can make you terribly impatient with your own achievements. You should let yourself express the heroic in you, not try to live up to the heroic, which is the wrong approach. The Olympians were interpretations of the heroic personages, at a time when boundaries weren't as clearly drawn between levels of consciousness, and people were more aware of their models or heroic selves. These bigger-than-life selves can't appear in just one lifetime. Their giant capacities won't fit into that context. Our governments and civilizations are also eccentric original versions of other heroic patterns, even versions that don't work here may succeed somewhere else. My experience in front of the supermarket when this book began was actually an exercise in sensing the heroic proportions of objects and people in just a small section of time. Now, I sense the heroic from the heroic side, at least to what degree I'm able. People concerned with discovering their purpose in life are sensing their heroic nature, only they interpret this in terms of progress, they want to know what to do. Instead, the heroic in those terms involves being. It's terribly difficult to describe what I feel, but the heroic dimension is a bigger-than-life state of being, out of which, quote, doing, end quote, emerges as a natural characteristic. By fully being, you are fulfilling your purpose in those terms. When we allow the heroic elements to flow from the psyche through the models to ourselves, we feel our own life in both worlds. The models are heroic patterns in the psyche and heroic personages at the same time. But these personages are real. Only the conditions of their existence are different than ours. When we try to pin them down to our definitions, we end up with distortions and myths. Again, these heroic patterns are behind everything, trees, animals, and all natural phenomenon, but also behind cultural entities such as governments, families, and laws. While I'm sensing all this, it's quite a balancing act to keep some of my consciousness here to take these notes, or rather to translate what I'm experiencing at another level, and to choose the words themselves. I seem to throw away or discard tons of words in a minute before finally settling on one. Seth says that time is open-ended. Well, I'm experiencing these heroic personages as open-ended psychologically. I feel them swirling into identities all the time, each identity valid and eternal in a psychic or heroic space, regardless of their relative duration in our ideas of time. My excitement with all this grows constantly, so that my handwriting is more and more scribbled, yet I insist on getting this down. These are a kind of consciousness outside of our experience. While retaining selfhood, they can mix and merge identities to get certain giant-sized effects. Only our reality springs out of theirs. and were endowed with a lesser dimensional version of their abilities and characteristics. The abilities and characteristics appear as aspects in the psyche, but on their own, they live a life outside our life, although connected with our lives through us. Yet in a way, we live in their environment, unknowingly to a large extent, as maybe animals live in our environment, unaware of certain aspects of it that have no meaning to them. Dawn came. I put my scribbled notes down and stared all around, alert, excited, and angry, because I felt all my abilities stretching to no particular avail. I sensed those other realities all about, just around the corner of my perceptions, but I couldn't bring them into focus. I sensed the support of the heroic dimensions, and the world itself took on certain properties of magnificence that almost made me cry. But I wanted more. Of course, I knew damned well that now I was trying too hard. And I was being too serious. So I had some oatmeal and coffee, read an innocuous magazine article, wrote a note to Rob, and crawled back into bed. When I rearranged the covers, Rob grunted, and the sound went right through me. Now, that was a heroic grunt, I thought. Suddenly I felt sleepy and silly in a normally happy fashion. I fell to sleep at once. Rob called me at noon. I ate a second breakfast while he ate lunch, and I read my notes to him. It was a lovely sunny day. I'd put a picnic table out in the otherwise empty half of our double garage, so I took out a cup of coffee and sat looking out the wide open garage door at the trees and hills across the road. Once again, the world was touched by that beautiful strangeness that seemed superimposed over everything. More, quote, comprehensions, end quote, started coming almost at once. Again, direct knowing was involved, in which I kept receiving these comprehensions that seemed to just come. I was pretty certain that the heroic dimensions and personages were my unconscious packaging of that primary direct information. An example of the almost instant transformation of inner revelatory data into understandable terms. This surely didn't diminish my experience. The heroic dimensions were real, more real perhaps than the picnic table at which I sat. I did notice something for the first time, though. The data was organized differently than usual thought processes. There was no line of thought. I seemed to get all sides of the material at once, a process impossible to translate in a sentence. Literally, you can't hold that kind of information. So, unconsciously, I formed the heroic dimension as a symbolic framework that stands for the information I received. It's the only information I'm aware of receiving, of course. But I could almost catch the symbol-building process happening beneath, and that seemed to involve a curious sense of psychological motion, familiar yet strange at once. It's as if I almost caught myself in the act of building a psychic structure to capture the information I was getting at still deeper layers. I almost heard invisible zoom, 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 until the structure, the heroic dimension, was strong enough to bear the meaning of the information, which itself could not be literally interpreted. For all this, to me, there is a heroic dimension and heroic personages who exist connected to each of us, reflected in our existences as we are in theirs. The air literally shimmered in the sunlight. I felt as if the patterns for the world were just at the other side of that shimmering. I scribbled down what I was getting, and again I'm including my original notes. Their unevenness and perhaps their circular organization itself gives a better hint of the experience than more grammatical descriptions I might write now. To me, at least, the notes themselves seem to pucker in places, suggesting my own feelings that reality, as we know it, did pucker and wrinkle, so that I could poke my consciousness through. I knew that I'd sensed the heroic personages before, many times, as the massive relatives I've described in some of my poetry, and that they were also connected with what I called my, quote, massive experiences, end quote, when I seemed to expand mentally and physically, expanding out into space. Now my notes, quote, experience of the heroic adds the heroic faculty to everything else and illuminates the nature of all visible things. Nature becomes supernature, even as it's perceived by the physical eye, because the sense of sight is endowed with heroic vision. It's as if our cat, Willie, saw our living room for a moment through our eyes and understood everything in it in the same way we do. That's how I feel just now. Only I lack the means to express what I know, as the cat's meows would be inadequate to express his new knowledge. The attributes of the heroic are surrounding us all the while, but we don't sense it and ignore the obvious clues to its existence. We share part of our environment with the animals, but they don't care. What we'd call the human elements, they couldn't read time by a clock, for instance. So we share some of our environment with heroic personages, as unaware of their psychological reality, never viewing this shared environment from their viewpoint. They know a time that includes ours, for example. And the animals share their own kind of heroic elements. And for that matter, they have no need to tell time by a clock. We come out of the heroic elements, hence the patterns of our world, the cells, atoms, and molecules, and so forth, emerge from the heroic dimensions. We dwell in the heroic in that it grows in our bodies, or is the medium in which our bodies grow. And we're eternal in the heroic. We touch upon it in dreams and visions, even though we view it through our own beliefs and thought patterns. We're growing toward consciousness, awareness of the heroic dimensions. Our visions and revelations are like momentary awakenings there, distorted glimpses, as a child might see an edge of a blanket when he awakened here, or might not focus properly, or might not see his mother's face, and think of her as a giant. She'd be a giant to his perception, but not to hers. Each lucid dream or vision or intuitive insight brings you more awake there, and actually awakens the heroic faculties, so that life is seen as one focus of many. Here we accept two focuses, waking and sleeping consciousness. There, our entire life experience here is just one part of a greater experience. Here, we forget most of our dreams. There, our lives, here are living dreams, three-dimensional. Only we waken from them there, remembering. Art is symbolic representation of the heroic. It's so damned hard to get a verbal hold on what I'm getting otherwise. But identity is both open-ended and formed of inviolate psychological boundaries simultaneously, and can operate in either manner without contradiction, maybe in the same way that light can act as waves or particles. This makes the God concept almost ungraspable in usual terms. But we feel terribly alone and cut off when we don't sense the heroic in one way or another. Children, for example, are bathed in it constantly, growing trustfully in the medium of the heroic. The heroic personages, of which we're part, couldn't experience Earth life. They're psychologically too big to fit, so we are extensions of them, while they're extensions of us only in a different, giant-sized way. We do add to their experience, though, and they add to ours. Christ's basic message was an ancient one, restated, that we survive death and have another existence elsewhere. It also dealt with heroic principles, love, devotion, honor couched in terms that would be understood at the time. The whole idea of self-sacrifice was grossly distorted through the ages. It's based on the understanding that the self is eternal and indestructible. Only then can so-called self-sacrifice be a heroic act, done with the recognition that nothing is lost or sacrificed, since the self's basic validity rests in the heroic dimensions. But that message was and still is almost impossible to explain here, too. Misunderstood or half understood, it leads to endless stupidities. For example, the belief that suffering is good for the soul, or half-cocked attempts to justify murder, since, as the reasoning goes, the self is just translated neatly from one existence to another. That version is one of the worst instances of interpreting intuitive information in literal terms. Seth is right, Christ never did exist in time, but did exist, and does, as a heroic personage, and as a giant-sized model for several historic persons. The myth then actualized the personage in terms we could understand. We had to believe in a literal rising from the dead of a physical person. Paul tuned in to his version of that heroic personage, was blinded by the vision, and interpreted it in his terms, as a soldier setting out to conquer the world with his truth. The ancient, quote, divine right of kings, end quote, was a distorted attempt to synchronize the heroic and historic. Pagan and Jewish sacrificial rites were also based on a literal interpretation, the idea being that in returning an animal or person to the heroic dimensions, you were certain of getting more of the same back, replenishing the stock by sending in a, quote, model, end quote, to be copied by a god or gods. The best of the crop or stock then served as the sacrifice. Cave drawings also represented this great love of images and patterns, instead of sacrificing, the artist drew a replica of what was required, sometimes distorting particular desired elements, such as strength and agility. The drawings served as blueprints, requesting nature to fill them out in flesh. This could also be connected with present native beliefs concerning cameras. The fear that the soul will become confused and leap into the replica image. End quote. I was still at the picnic table, scribbling as quickly as I could, as I wrote the following in response to these, quote, comprehensions, end quote. The shimmering quality of the afternoon began to accelerate. In the center, bold and in all caps, attributes and characteristics of the heroic dimensions. Quote, the heroic dimension involves a different scale of existence, outside of time. This isn't a static sameness frozen eternally, but a scale in which action happens outside of time as we know it. Not sure that I can get this straight, but it could be that change there could be so slow to our standards that we wouldn't perceive motion at all, but think everything stationary and eternal. There, though, motion would be happening at its own characteristic rate, characteristic of the heroic dimension. The heroic personages aren't dead ideals, perfection personified, but super-creative, heroic-sized, psychological gestalts, and our own creative abilities are our closest connections with them. Our imaginative faculties are also important in this respect, since it's nearly impossible for us to perceive the heroic directly, even though we use our own heroic faculties, then even this material I'm getting now is bound to be a creative model or version of the heroic. We can't get a, quote, literal fact, end quote, interpretation because the heroic exists outside of the fact framework and beyond it. Facts are materialized events from that dimension apparent in space-time as evidential. Something odd happens as I write this. I get a disconnected from time feeling, which is a trifle scary. Fascinating but scary. As if while I'm writing, the garage and yard and everything that I see exists eternally, and time begins just out of my sight, around the corner maybe. But the birds are singing. A plane goes by overhead. I feel this is one eternal moment, say, called 4:30 p.m., where I am, and where everything that I can see exists. But outside of this spot, time goes on, and it's 4:35 in the kitchen, beyond my sight, and outside of this crazy framework. But I feel so weird. Flesh action keeps into the scene before me from non-time, flowing into this eternal moment I'm somehow in. The birds fly from branch to branch. My hand writes. I'm swinging one leg back and forth. This isn't just repetitive action. I can do anything I want. But all this, and it never gets to be 4:35. Not here. But when I lose whatever this is, this heroic non-time, then I'll step right into, say, 4:40 or whatever, without knowing what really happened. It's a different dimension. With our time, I don't know how to explain it without using the word time, within any given moment that's eternal yet filled with change. Maybe it's really heroic time and only seems outside of time to me. Maybe it's just a kind of, quote, long time, end quotes from her. I glanced around again, everything looked so splendid, changing yet eternal. But some creature unease grabbed hold of me. I picked up my papers and went into the house where the kitchen clock said 5 p.m. Then, curious and safely inside time, I looked out the kitchen window at the yard, and time was outside there now, too. Yet all the material I'd received that afternoon only represented a glimmer of the subjective comprehensions that I couldn't translate into understandable terms. And that material seemed to come from someplace else too, of course. As if there was an invisible mail slot in my mind, and foreign letters from other worlds kept dropping down. Only I had to translate them, and they kept coming. I fixed dinner. Rob and I ate in the living room and watched a television show. I did the dishes. Then I sat by the front windows, watching the summer twilight. Again, the comprehensions began. This time, most of them escaped my notes entirely. We live in air, yet our breathing is automatic. And while we take air for granted, in a strange way we overlook it, too. Yet it's the medium in which we exist physically. That night, as I sat looking out the window at the mountains, it was as if I became altered to a psychological medium in which we live. I felt a psychological support, the existence of an invisible something that supported my mental and emotional being in the same way that, say, the ground supports everything on top of it. But psychologically, I grew out through this medium, as a tree grows through the earth while still being a part of it. The heroic is the medium in which this existence takes place. I knew this in ways I can't explain, and I felt it sustained this world and my own psychological existence. Some feelings came back that I remembered having in childhood when I felt that no matter what happened in normal life, I was loved and safe, quote, someplace else, end quote. As I sat there, I felt reassured, safe, but most of all, free. Most of my early years, I realized, had been lived in unquestioning acceptance of the heroic. The heroic provides an emotional support that animals possess in their own way, a support that I saw I'd been missing for some time. Its lack brings about a feeling of a fall from grace. Was I in the process of regaining it? When we lose that inner certainty, we feel abandoned, no matter what our achievements. We recognize that some precarious, indefinable joy not dependent upon events seems gone from our lives. Looking back, I could see where I'd regain it to some degree, only to turn back to the official line of consciousness as the criterion of reality. And then the obvious contradictions between the two approaches would reappear. I was up again early the next morning. We went to bed around 1 a.m. and woke around 4:30. I ate oatmeal and drank some coffee and sat at my desk. At once the comprehensions started up again. I used an analogy to try to explain the concepts I was getting. And while the analogy isn't the best, it's the best I could come up with. I compared the grown adult and its relationship with its own child self to the heroic personage and its relationship with us. That is, children grow from fetuses to adults, led by heroic principles and patterns for development. The complicated patterns for the adult exist in the fetus then, and lead it toward adulthood. For simplicity's sake, I ignored probabilities which would also operate even at cellular levels. In those terms, each of us is one version of a heroic personage who is leading us toward development by acting as a model in the same way that our own adulthood, in pattern form, led the fetus toward its own growth into us. In that regard, the adult is always present in the child as a model, biologically and psychologically, though not historically and actually present. Yet the child grows in response or toward that becoming, and is itself part of the overall pattern without which adulthood would be impossible. In the same way, the heroic personages as models are present in us, adult and child alike, though not historically actualized. The child, though, trusts it will grow up, while at the one level of consciousness there seems to be, quote, no place else to go, end quote, for the adult. The time-space orientation of the usual level of consciousness makes further development appear impossible. The entire historic personality is part of an overall heroic pattern or heroic personage that, from our viewpoint, is outside of time. For that matter, the adult to be is outside of the child's present too. The historic personages operate as the aspects of the historic personality, but they exist actualized within the heroic dimensions regardless of the posture of the historic personality in time. The focused personality is the historic personality, focused along its living area of birth-to-death reality, while the heroic personages are source selves. I saw that acceptance and recognition of the heroic by any name gives a heroic cast to man, life, and the universe. But it also adds emotional richness to normal life and fills it out with that indefinable sense of basic trust, without which life itself can seem meaningless. With that feeling of the heroic, the individual doesn't feel isolated from the universe, but united with it, so that its goals and the individual's are merged, not divergent, or worse, in opposition. The presence of the heroic everywhere pervades the world, and through a constant give and take between historic and heroic experience, all events are formed, including our lives. The heroic dimensions are the larger-than-life source out of which our world emerges. Yet our own world is part of the heroic. It was all so simple, as I felt it, that I couldn't understand how I hadn't known all this before. It was completely obvious that all my experiences since starting this book were leading me to the heroic dimensions, that all the calls and letters led me to ask the particular kinds of questions for others and for myself that would inevitably lead me to this point, because this was the proper way for me to grow. I felt as if I were forming myself and also being formed into some beneficial psychic shape in the same way, say, that hands took on the correct number of fingers. What's important in all this is the emotional realization and intuitive knowledge of our roots and our constant nourishment. We feel a sense of loving direction, the assurance that we're growing toward our proper psychological and psychic shape in the same way that we grew physically into adults. Yet many of us get unsynchronized with ourselves and nature along the way, and lose that sense of deep satisfaction. It seems that some magic and richness has vanished from life that we only dimly recall. A gap opens in our experience so that no event, however joyful, lives up to some vaguely remembered, quote, Garden of Eden, end quote. And little by little our energy and zest diminish. With emotional recognition of the heroic, however, we know that despite all seeming contradictions, we are each significant, our slightest motion is a vital gesture on the part of the universe. We understand that we are each part of a loving pattern, and as we are rich, poor, beautiful, ugly, with our weaknesses and strengths alike, and that to rip us out of that context would do damage to the entire framework. This recognition brings about a feeling tone that tunes us into the heroic, replenishes, heals, and strengthens us and deepens our creativity. Therefore, it has a biological as well as psychic basis. It returns us to the feeling of a caring universe and beautifully reconciles individual identity with its position as part of an underlying overall pattern. Without this recognition, the historic or focus personality defends its barriers desperately, feeling itself alone and impotent in an uncaring universe. In the center, bold and in all caps, the heroic and the historic. Seth says that we form our reality through our conscious beliefs, but he also stresses that the conscious mind doesn't know how this is done and has little to do with the actual inner processes involved. Those processes are heroic, out of space-time, but ever flowing into our reality as effects. We direct them through our beliefs and intents. But how? Something gives us a life, a body, a physical world of relatedness, a historic self, the focused personality alive in time. Seth emphasizes that all this is given. If this isn't understood, we put too much stress upon normal consciousness, forgetting the source of its strength. We forget that the psyche or inner self is always there and available, because it seems so separated from our usual consciousness. But the psyche is as natural as a flower bud. Watch an amaryllis plant sometime. In less than 2 weeks it grows a flower stalk some 2 to 3 feet high from one bulb. 4 giant flowers emerge, sometimes 5 inches across. You couldn't put the stalk back inside. How did 4 such large flowers spring up so quickly from a comparatively small bulb? Where did they come from? Quote, simple. Someone says, that's nature, end quote. Right, and it's also heroic. The plant's reality in our world springs from its hidden heroic pattern. We get here the same way, only the mathematics are different. But besides that, and our physical growth, which is perceivable, there is a development of personality that has no physical shape to keep track of. Yet it, too, follows an invisible heroic pattern and leans toward those conditions that best favor its growth. In other words, I think that the focused personality has numerous patterns of probable fulfillment from which it constantly chooses. This became clear to me that Thursday morning. The entire week I'd been getting this material on heroics and applying it personally. The heroic self is the original, creative, unexpected self, presenting rich patterns and alternate choices that can appear quite unconventional or unrespectable to the focused personality. And I saw how I'd often restricted its actions by my own attitudes. Most of my most creative work has come when I wasn't expecting it, when I was dallying or daydreaming or thinking of something else. For example, my writing production is considerable, yet I used my writing schedule almost like a whip, as if I'd never write another word if I didn't put in so many hours a day. I mistrusted any impulse during that time that might take me from my desk, and I saw that I'd robbed myself of unexpected opportunities that might have come precisely because I forgot my ideas about my work. The heroic provides a larger framework in which we can encounter the unexpected. And while I might be more permissive than others in that respect, I still wanted the unexpected to give proper notice. I knew that I'd have to discover more about the heroic personages, for example, and that I wanted to explore the heroic dimension. But I wasn't plunging in. I wanted the unexpected on my terms. Yet I could feel the atmosphere of the heroic all about me, so constantly that my earlier ignorance seemed incomprehensible. While I was typing some of this week's material, 2 other paragraphs inserted themselves. I knew that they were from James's book, quote, "There is, however, within man a sense of the heroic, that is, the faculty for perceiving within himself the inner larger design or pattern of the soul. For this surrounds us always. We move in it as fishes do in the ocean, and all our actions mix and merge with the great rippling rhythms that form and support the more surface evidence of our days. This inner faculty allows us to glimpse those deeper currents, to plunge into living with the zest of an instinctive yet trained swimmer, who is exuberantly aware of the power and the majesty of the waves, and able to identify himself with the splendor of the ocean's motion." End quote. And I wondered, had I pursued James' book, would I have been led by another route to the same place, the heroic dimension? I remembered the other paragraph that had reminded me of James a few days previously, and the connections became clear. The pages that I'd read from months ago had been in the middle of the book I'd seen in the library, and devoted to James's discussion of melancholy. The last part that I didn't see was devoted to the heroic faculties in man and their power to banish melancholy and fear. Still, I'd been changing myself during that week. I could feel a new self trying to grow out of the old one, and I kept trying to be both at the same time. In Chapter 25. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.